Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Big Bass Podcast, the fishing show where size matters. I'm Terry Battisti.
And I'm Ken Duke. Our producer and engineer is the lovely and talented voice of his generation, none other than Nathan Benson. In this episode of the Big Bass Podcast, well, we're going to go kind of far afield and do some weird stuff in this one. It started out, Terry, I wanted to see which states recognize things like cane pole records and stuff like that. I wanted to see just where the lines were drawn for a lot of states. So, yes, I looked at all 50 state fishing regulations, and which took way longer than I ever imagined and was more tedious than I hoped. And I didn't really get a lot of the cane pole stuff that I was hoping for, but I found a lot of other weird things that I think is just as interesting, and I hope just as interesting to our audience. But it's all about some of the weird categories and things that different states around the country acknowledge when they're looking at not just fish records, but in particular, I was concerned, of course, about bass records because a lot of fish records are not game fish. They're considered rough fish like gar or carp or stuff like that, and it's pretty much a free for all as to how you can catch those things or harvest those things or just blow those things out of the water. But bass is usually treated a little more carefully, and that's where we're going with this episode of the Big Bass Podcast. We're going with some strange records around the country. And I want you to start it off.
Well, thank you, Ken. I appreciate that. Yeah, and we're going to start off in a state that I actually lived in for about a year, the state of Missouri, the Show Me State. And it's got some, I would say, interesting rules associated with their fish and game. And here's what they say in their regulations. You may take fish by pole and line, trot line, trow line, limb line.
Through line, yeah.
Yeah. Oh, throw line, limb line, bank line, and jug line. Ice fishing tackle or tip-ups are considered a pole and line method. Now, I think that should be obvious. Missouri recognizes the state record largemouth bass on a trot line, and their record is 8 pounds, 2 ounces on a trot line.
Yeah.
And they also have a limb line largemouth bass record, which is 4 pounds, 4 ounces. And Missouri also recognizes the state record smallmouth bass on a trot line in at 2 pounds, 11 ounces, and their limb line smallmouth record is 4 pounds, 2 ounces. Then also Missouri recognizes a state record spotted bass on a jug line at 2 pounds, 11 ounces.
Yeah,
I don't know what to say.
These are methods usually people are going after catfish.
Yeah, exactly.
Trot lines, limb lines, jugs. These are catfish methods.
Why don't they have a tournament circuit, a limb line tournament circuit?
Oh, don't. I think Terry Battisti could be the Ray Scott of limb lining for bass.
Just saying.
That limb starts shaking in that willow tree, and we got a good one.
Could you imagine bringing a 15-pound limit to the scale with limb line?
I think that would be fabulous. Absolutely fabulous. Our next stop, not too far from Missouri, just you got to go through Arkansas, and you get to Louisiana. And Louisiana recognizes 2 classifications of fishing record. They recognize rod and reel stuff, and they recognize fly rods. And for all their rules, they say fish has got to be caught by sporting means on a rod, reel, and line. So they're kind of saying no cane poles here because they're specifying that a reel needs to be on there. But then they go on to say, or some other conventional form of regular fishing tackle. And that's a quote right out of their regs. So maybe a cane pole is allowed. It says that fish caught on hand lines, set lines, or any form of net, trap, or seine. A lot of the stuff that Missouri just said is okay. Louisiana says no go. And you also can't mutilate a fish by shooting it, foul hooking it, snagging it, or by any other fish. So if your fish has been mangled by a shark, for example, it will not be considered something you can keep or something that could be registered as a record. So Louisiana, of all places, is actually a little tighter on their rules than Missouri. And you know, we've talked about this before. I think there are 2 states out there, Terry, that the State Outdoor Writers Association is in charge of the records. Louisiana is one, and Ohio is the other.
Yeah.
But one thing that's where Louisiana goes above and beyond, and I really admire them for this, is they maintain an official top 10 in many of the categories. If you want to see the top 10 largemouth bass ever caught in the state, right there on the Louisiana Outdoor Writers Association site. So good for folks in the sportsman state.
Yeah. And it kind of goes back to Oregon, right? Remember we did the Oregon largemouth bass, and their state Department of Fish and Game
I thought it was a club. I thought
5. Well, yeah, you're right. It was the Oregon Bass and Panfish Club. That's right.
Do you have your membership in that organization yet?
Not yet. Not yet.
Unbelievable. Folks.
Yeah.
Terry Battisti deserves an honorary membership in the Oregon Bass and Panfish Club. He has given it more publicity than I dare say any member has in some considerable period of time.
I don't know about that.
So we need to step up and get Terry in the Oregon Bass and Panfish Club. And
oh man.
Next up
is the state of Nevada. The the gambling state. I don't know what Nevada's called.
Is Nevada a silver state?
Yeah, it's a silver state. That's right. Yep. Anyway, Nevada's state records are officially recognized by the Nevada Department of Wildlife, and their records were established from the year 1968. So evidently, they had no fish prior to 1968 in the state of Nevada.
Well, unfortunately, it's much worse than that. It's much worse than that, as you're about to tell us.
Yeah, exactly. It's the first year of the Nevada Trophy Fish Program, and it's run through December of 2022. The sad thing about it is that all records prior to 1968 were expunged.
No, all records prior, everything prior to that is expunged, and they acknowledge that there were bigger fish.
Exactly.
They just don't care.
It's no boomer fish allowed.
They just don't care, and that's sad.
It's ridiculous. Then the other things that they got is the fish can only be taken with a hook and line attached to a rod and a reel, and closely attended in the manner known as angling. Okay. I mean, so you got a catfish, you got 2 rods out or even 1 rod out for catfish, and you're fishing at night, and you just happen to have a bell on the end of your rod, and you doze off for sleep, for a few minutes, and you hear the bell ringing, and you bring in a state record catfish. Are they not going to count because you were sleeping? Or
I think they might. They go into some of that detail in the regs with a lot of these states. They talk a lot about closely attended, and some of them set very clear standards, like you got to be within 100 yards or something like that. I think if you've got a bell on the tip of your rod, they're going to say it was closely attended. But who knows? There's a lot of ambiguity in some of that stuff.
Well, especially this last rule here, where they say spearfishing and bow fishing is for unprotected fish only. What are the unprotected fish? I assume that they have
the unprotected fish are non-game fish. Anything that's not a game fish is an unprotected fish. And they delineate what the game fish are. And of course, in every state, a bass is considered a game fish, except Alaska, where they're not even mentioned. But every other state, bass is a game fish. Now, in Minnesota divides its fishing records into 2 classifications. They have a weight classification, and they have a catch and release classification. And that's not unusual. There's a number of states that do that. But here's what's weird. In Minnesota, catch and release only applies to 4 species. Just 4, and none of them are bass. It only applies to muskie, northern pike, lake sturgeon, and flathead catfish. So
Why?
I don't know, because they don't. Well, the short answer is they don't properly respect the bass. That's the short answer. The long answer,
is the state
I'm sure,
that Al Lindner and Ron Lindner are from, and now, well, they're not.
Well, they're from Illinois. But
right?
they've lived most of their lives in of course
Brainerd,
Ron
Minnesota.
passed away. Yeah, but Al and Ron both lived most of the time in Minnesota, and who has done more? I would say I'm going to say this. I'm going to say that, go on a limb here and say that Al Lindner is likely the greatest multi-species freshwater angler our country has ever produced. How about that?
Mm-hmm. Oh, I'd agree with that 100%.
Al Lindner is a hero of mine, and wonderful guy, dynamic personality, just a fabulous person, and I think maybe the greatest multi-species freshwater angler in American history.
I think that
kudos to you, Al Lindner.
I think that we need to corner Al at some point in time and tell him to fight for the bass, the smallmouth and the largemouth of Minnesota. Because what do you do? Does that mean that you have to kill that fish in order to get the record? I mean, usually that's what it means.
That's exactly what it means.
That's crazy. It's the same rule as in Massachusetts. Remember, we went through that whole Massachusetts thing.
Yeah, you can't transport a live fish in Massachusetts.
Yeah, that's nuts.
It gets weird. It gets weird. Yeah. Next up
is Utah, the state that I spent quite a bit of time in when I lived just up north in Idaho. Utah's got catch and keep for weight and catch and release for length. So if you're going to catch and keep it, you're going to get a record possibly by weighing it. And if you release it, you can take a certified length and let it go. Also, they have spearfishing, set line, and archery records. Or actually, archery or bow fishing there is huge for carp.
Not just for carp, Terry Battisti.
Oh,
not
really?
Just for carp.
Yeah. Well, we're gonna talk about that in a couple minutes here, or a couple seconds. So they got spearfishing and set. The crazy thing, and I did not know this, is that they actually have state spearfishing records for largemouth bass and for smallmouth bass. Who the heck is gonna spearfish for either of those? But evidently,
for bass.
Yeah, but evidently, some dude or angler got an 8-pound, 8-ounce fish in 2011, a largemouth, by spearfishing. And then their record for smallmouth bass in the spearfish category is 5.2. Why?
These numbers, these weights are not terribly far off the
state record,
angling records.
Yeah, yeah.
And there's a trout line record in Utah for smallmouth at get this. What's the weight, Terry? This is embarrassing. Who would even enter this fish? Go ahead, tell them.
1 pound, 1 ounce in 2000.
1 pound, 1 ounce on a trot line, or as in some places they call it a set line. Whoever you are, how dare you? How dare you register that fish?
Oh,
have you no pride, sir or ma'am?
It's horrible. It's horrible.
Have you no pride? Unbelievable.
Anyway,
I don't mind people. I don't mind there being spearfishing or trot lines or stuff like that allowed for bass. Doesn't bother me a bit. People like to eat these fish. Bass are only game fish and recognized as game fish in their earliest instances because they're good to eat. That's the only reason. But to set up angling records for them when they're spearfished or on a trot line or a limb line or a jug, to call that angling? Really? Really?
There's no catch and release with a spearfish.
No, there's absolutely not. And you know what? The irony is, this one blows me away, because we've been talking about some of the states that have records for weight and also have records for catch and release. Those records are invariably based on length. Well, if you have a fish that you enter in the catch and release category, you have to release that fish, which usually makes it ineligible in the weight category.
Yep.
Which means that you can't hold both records. Your fish might have been the longest and the heaviest, but you can't have both because of the screwy system. Anyway, I digress. In Nebraska, Terry, in Nebraska, you're not allowed to snag fish and keep them. You can get them with a bow and arrow, but only using a hand-drawn longbow or crossbow. Or crossbow. Also in Nebraska, you cannot use a surface spear. You can't be standing above the water and spear a fish, but you can go below the water and spear them like with a spear gun. And believe it or not, they have a state record largemouth by bow and arrow, and that's 814. Jeez. And the state record largemouth by underwater powered spear is 7 1/4. The state record smallmouth by bow and arrow, 3 pounds 9 ounces. State record smallmouth by underwater powered spear, 512 1/2. State record spotted
before the spear blew out half of its guts.
Exactly. The state record spotted bass by bow and arrow, 2 pounds 6 ounces. State record spotted bass by underwater spear gun, 2 pounds 7 ounces. Really, really, Nebraska? Really? That's what you got?
Yeah, no, there's nothing sporting about that at all.
No.
Now, mind you, I think spearfishing big tuna, or some of the sport fish in the ocean that they're free diving for. I think that's sport in itself because you have an opportunity of dying. Right?
Yes.
Whenever death is imminent or possible, I think that there's some sport in that. But come on, folks, a 4-pound bass?
Are things that dull in Nebraska? Has college football let you down that badly over the last few years that you've got to acknowledge these records? Really? I mean, I'm from Georgia, back-to-back national titles, but really, are things that bad in Nebraska? You're up, Doctor.
All right, we're going to go to the Northeast, and we're going to talk about Vermont, where both caught and released fish are not eligible for state record consideration.
So you got to kill it. You got to kill it. To be a state record.
Yeah, exactly. The body of water where the fish was caught must be listed.
I love that rule, Terry.
I don't know.
I love it.
So Joe's farm pond has to be listed in order for it to be considered a record-producing body of water, or to have the opportunity to provide a record fish.
Well, hey, I live in Florida, where the current state record was caught in an unnamed lake in Polk County, which is the county I live in. And way before that, what should be the state record in Florida, caught by Fritz Friebel back in 1923, I hope you'll go back and watch that show, he lied about the lake he caught it in. Yeah. So I like it if they're telling us, hey, you gotta list where it was caught. So sign me up for that. That's a good rule. I like it.
Yeah. So next rule would be fishing by means of hook and line in hand or attached to a rod or other device in open water, or fishing by casting or trolling baited hooks, artificial flies, or lures. It's considered open water fishing, and it's required for bass. Why do
some
they
interesting
even have to
stuff
here?
Yeah. It's some different stuff, different rules. Pennsylvania is the only state that has this rule, Terry. And digging through these state regs is a challenge. And the first thing I want to say about the state regs is we've all gone and purchased our license and picked up a hard copy of the state rules, state regs on fishing or hunting or whatever. And what a lot of people don't realize is those are really just the highlights put in layman's terms. Okay? The actual regs are quite often legislation, or at the very least an administrative document that's been created by bureaucrats and lawyers. And it's a much more difficult document, and if you had to carry it around, it'd be the size of a big book. But anyway, this is the only time I've seen a rule anything like this. Pennsylvania rule says, and I'm quoting here, it is unlawful to cast repeatedly into a clearly visible bass spawning nest in an effort to catch or take a bass. Pennsylvania has just outlawed bed fishing, Terry.
And I just got done reading John Alden Knight's book, Bass Fishing. And in that book, not only do they mention Hardin and H.W. Ross, but they specifically mention this bed fishing rule and that it is illegal. And this book was written in 1948 or 1949. So that rule's been on the book for a long time. You are not allowed to catch a fish off the bed in Pennsylvania.
And most states take care of this problem by setting the fishing season late enough that the spawning is over. But in Pennsylvania, they're going to double dog take care of that by prohibiting you from making multiple casts to a nest. Very interesting.
With a smallmouth, a lot of the times all you need is one cast.
Yeah, they're a lot more aggressive than a largemouth, but it's also a lot deeper. Typically, the nests are a lot deeper, and it's a lot more challenging maybe to get a bait right on top of it because it is so deep and the bait drifts or whatever. But there you go. They've made it illegal.
Yep. Wisconsin. That's the next one. And Wisconsin, for our buddy Nathan Benson, our engineer.
Born in Wisconsin, the dairy state.
Yep. And our buddy Stumpjack. So Wisconsin recognizes hooks. Wisconsin recognizes hooks and line for weight records and live release for length records. Again, like the other states that do that. And alternate methods that consist of spear, bow and arrow, crossbow for these other alternate records. There is no alternate method records used for bass, so I guess that would be either hook and line for weight and release for length.
Yeah, but it is legal to take bass apparently by these alternate methods: spear, bow and arrow, or crossbow. It's just they don't have records on the books for them right now. From what I can gather, that's the distinction at the moment.
Now,
there are several states like that.
I also know that Dave, our buddy, actually does spearfish sturgeon up there. And so they'll wait till the ice forms and they'll sit above a hole in the ice for extended amounts of times waiting for a sturgeon to swim past their hole, and they'll drop a spear. And I know his daughter got a big sturgeon that way a few years ago. So maybe Dave can say in the comments, what this crazy rule is.
Speaking of states with a lot of ice, let's take it to North Dakota. They've got a couple of categories. They've got a hook and line category, and they've got an archery category, but the archery part is for non-game fish only. Game fish may not be taken by bow and arrow or by spear, but you can underwater spearfish for largemouth bass, but get this, Terry, not smallmouth bass. You can only use an underwater spear gun for largemouths, not for smallmouths.
Hardin would have had a hell of a time. He would have been totally
think about
confused.
That. He would have been, that would have been an awkward situation for him. Walter Hardin would be doing time in North Dakota because that would have been more than he could handle, I'm sure. Go back and listen to Walter Hardin and the Florida smallmouth bass world record, folks. One of our
it just wasn't world record; it was world records plural.
Yeah, he was. This guy was probably the greatest record bass angler of all time, Walter Hardin of Pennsylvania, fishing in Florida. Check it out. It's a good show.
Yep,
it's a good show.
All
Let's
right.
get away from the ice for a moment.
Yeah, let's go to Mississippi, where our good buddy Spooky Mike lives.
Spooky Mike Davis, Spooky Mike, Jiggy Mike, Iron Mike.
Yep. And Mike was on the show this a couple weeks ago, talking to us about the Anthony Denny state record. But let's get onto some of these records here, or the rules for the records. And Mississippi Records recognizes rod and reel and fly fishing categories. And they state that game fish may only be taken by hook and line with one or more hooks. Now, how many hooks does that? Is that 50 hooks? Is it, 3 hooks? And is it 3 treble hooks or 3 single hooks? I don't know. And that is including rod reel with an artificial bait, trot lines, trowel lines, or throw lines, excuse me.
Lines, yeah.
Limb lines, set hooks, free floating fishing devices, i.e., jugs or pool noodles, which is a lot of people use pool noodles these days for jug fishing, and yo-yos. Are we talking Duncan yo-yos? Are we gonna,
You know what we're talking about, right?
or what? No, I don't.
Maybe,
What's a yo-yo?
okay, maybe
No, I
it's a
don't know
subtle
here.
thing. Okay, a yo-yo looks a lot like the conventional Duncan yo-yo. Imagine, and what it really is like the spool you would put your ID card on if you needed to pull it out and pass it over a sensor. Some people put them on one of those coil things. Yeah, exactly. Well, in the South anyway, when I was growing up, that would be called a yo-yo. And what happens is it's got a trigger when something, you'd put it on a limb or hang it on a limb or something like that, or a jug perhaps. And what happens is the fish hits, the fish strikes and pulls, and that triggers the yo-yo to reel itself up.
Oh.
And so it's like having an electric reel right on your deal there. So that's how that works. So, and it's called a yo-yo because it does have that yo-yo effect.
Interesting. Okay.
I've never fished that way, but I've certainly seen that equipment and know people who used to do that.
Never heard of it. I learned something new today.
There you go. Illinois, Terry, Illinois. And quoting here: any individual possessing a valid sport fishing license may take aquatic life by hand or may use pole and line, bank pole and line, throw line, trot line, buoyed ganging devices, or other legal devices not exceeding 50 hooks in the aggregate. So in Illinois, you can do pretty much what you want as long as you don't have more than 50 hooks out there. And
I guess umbrella rigs or A-rigs are, no problem.
I guess so. I guess this would cover umbrella rigs. And, it's interesting. A lot of these state regulations, not a lot, but a few of these state regulations call them Alabama rigs by name. So that means that these states have altered their regulations within the last 10 or 12 years when the Alabama rig really came to prominence. But, as I mentioned at the top of the show, Terry, one of the reasons I wanted to dig into this, I was curious about the regs and attitude toward a cane pole and whether or not a cane pole would be legal for catching a record fish. And what I've come to understand from reading so many regs now is that in almost every state, a cane pole is a legit sporting method to catch a fish. And I'm glad for that. I'm glad for that for a couple of reasons. Although a few states do require a reel, and they mention a reel specifically, most do not. And although I don't think a cane pole is typically the way I want to go, I think when D. Thomas was tule dipping, he was sport fishing. I think when tenkara anglers, which is basically just fly fishing without a reel, those guys are certainly sport fishing. So I think it's only fair and appropriate that a cane pole or a tenkara rod or a tule dipping rod circa 1968 D. Thomas, I think that's sport fishing, and I like it.
Yeah, I would agree with it 100%. But the other thing that's cool about the cane pole, it may not have been, I didn't see any cane poles growing up in the West, but it's a huge thing here in the South still.
Oh yeah,
And many kids start out with a cane pole.
I did. I started
And
with the cane pole.
could you imagine a kid catching a record crappie or a record bluegill on a cane pole and not having it recognized because it was caught on a cane pole? That would be horrible.
In a lot of ways, you have a lot more advantages with a rod and reel than a person does with a cane pole. I mean, if a record
Oh,
fish
absolutely.
grabs your bait and you've got it on a cane pole or a tenkara rod, you
Yeah.
have almost no chance
Yeah,
of
especially
catching
when you
that
get a big one.
fish.
No,
Yeah,
that's absolutely right.
unless you have
It takes
65-pound braid on there, you're probably not
right.
going to
Yeah.
put that fish on the bank or in the boat.
No, and the Tenkara rods. I mean, that is true sport fishing. I mean, they're using a lot of the times it's just a flat 1 pound or 2 pound test on this 8 to 13 foot rod, and you don't have there's no drag. You're relying on the action of that rod to keep the fish pinned and the line not to break. It's
It's essentially a cane pole. I've got a couple of tenkara rods, and
yeah,
it's a lot of fun. It's a cool
yep,
thing.
yep,
All right, you got a fun one to
yeah.
wrap up this episode here.
The last one, and Andy Williamson up in South Dakota is going to love this, because we're going to South Dakota, Andy. Uh, the state recognizes a bow fishing record for largemouth bass, and the biggest one is 2 pounds 5 ounces, caught in July of this year, 2023. The state also
Shame on you. Shame on you, South Dakota.
has an unrestricted category for fish taken by any legal means other than hook and line or bow fishing. And it includes set line and snagging. Does it include little green grenades,
I
frog
think
colored
yeah,
grenades?
it includes grenades.
Yeah, it's
I
wow.
think
I mean,
drone strafing is a category in
yeah,
South Dakota.
exactly. Drone fishing. I mean, that's there's people in Hawaii that are using drones and on the East Coast they're using drones to take their bait out 400 yards and getting fish off the surf that have never seen a lure before or whatever. But yeah, I mean, if you've got an explosives license in South Dakota, does that make it legal for you
Well,
to use explosives?
it's probably not quite that bad. But tell them about the unrestricted
Oh,
category smallmouth.
yeah. Okay, so we got currently recognized a smallmouth bass weighing 6 pounds 1 ounce as the current state record in the unrestricted category, and that fish was speared in 2016. God, are we cavemen or what? I mean, a
Again,
six
I got
pound
no
smallie.
problem. I
That's a
got no problem with them killing these fish and catching them by any means necessary because hey, fishing for some people is a subsistence activity. It's not a
yeah,
sporting activity. It's used to put food on the table, and I respect that.
yeah.
Um, but let's not call it sport fishing and put them in some kind of record book.
No,
Let's
yeah, I agree with that.
that's
Now,
that's too far.
there are quite a few native reservations up there, and maybe the rules have been written for them, so they've got something to shoot for, literally.
These regulations that we have been telling you all about on this program are statewide or at least beyond simply one or two bodies of water. These are
Hmm.
by and large statewide, and by the way, the most challenging state to look into the state regs and stuff I think was Montana, which divides its state into three regions, and in each of those regions is a nightmare to figure out. So thank you, Montana, for that.
Well, not only do you have so one of those reasons is Yellowstone National Park, right?
I'm
And
sure.
and that is the most confusing of all the regulations that I've ever had to deal with, because it every single river and creek in that national park has different regs, and they even break it down into headwaters, I mean, you could be fishing, this stretch of the whatever, the fire hole or whatever, and then you go 30 yards that way, and you got to be paying attention to different regulations on the same body of water. I mean, I fished Yellowstone like 3 times, and I just gave up because it was just too much of a pain in the butt to understand what the hell would keep me out of
Very
trouble.
confusing.
Yep.
Well, Dr. Battisti, this has been a strange episode of the Big Bass Podcast, but I think that gives you all some insight. And if we didn't mention your state, apologies on that, but that just means that your state is not wildly off the mark.
Right.
Any state that did not get
Take that
mentioned,
as a compliment.
Yeah, take it as a compliment. I didn't think you were so far out in left field that it needed to be a spotlight put on it. We'll probably revisit this because there are some interesting other rules out there. Texas has a rule that I actually like. They have state records for fish from public waters and state records on fish from private waters. And I think that's kind of interesting. I'm not because that's always an interesting dilemma. Do you recognize a fish from private water? Texas has kind of got that figured out. So kudos to the Lone Star State. But I think it's time to slam the door, Terry, on this episode of the Big Bass Podcast. Thank you, folks, for joining us. We know your time is valuable. We really appreciate your spending some of it with us. If you enjoyed the show, please hit the like and subscribe buttons. We hear that means a lot. And if you really liked it, if you thought this was great and perhaps the finest dialogue you've ever heard in the history of humankind, share it with your friends. That would help us even more. These algorithms that determine a lot about how far our reach can go are beyond my understanding. Terry, I'm sure, has tremendous grasp on them, and Nathan knows everything. But I know nothing. But anything like that is going to help us a lot. We really want to grow the show, and it's been a challenge. If you're a Big Bass junkie, check out our website at thebigbasspodcast.com. You're going to find our Big Bass Podcast calculator there. It's good for bass over 14.5 pounds, so you got to step up your game to plug in some numbers on that, created by none other than Dr. Terry J. Battisti. And we have lists of state record largemouth, smallmouth, and spotted bass on the site as well. If you want to contact us, you can reach us via email at ken@thebigbasspodcast.com, terry@thebigbasspodcast.com, and nathan@thebigbasspodcast.com. Please join us again next week. We will bring you another story about another big bass or something to do with the world of bass fishing that you will not and cannot find anywhere else. What do they need to remember, Terry?
Size matters.